There's a particular kind of emotional self-sufficiency that exists in people who grew up in the 1980s. Not the confidence kind, the kind where you learned very early that your inner world was yours to manage alone. You can be in a room full of people who love you and still feel like you're watching everything from behind glass. And here's what nobody talks about. You've been doing this so long, you don't even realize you're doing it anymore. If you grew up in the 80s, there's a psychological architecture inside you that was built in an era that no longer exists. And it's shaping every relationship, every ambition, every quiet anxiety you have today in ways you've never connected. You know that feeling when someone asks you what's wrong and you automatically say nothing, even when something clearly is? You've perfected the art of seeming fine. You can be falling apart internally and still show up, still function, still smile at the right moments. There's a part of you that believes asking for help is somehow admitting defeat. You're more comfortable being the person others lean on than being the one who leans. And when you do share something vulnerable, there's this split second afterwards where you regret it, where you feel like you've revealed too much, like you've broken some unspoken rule you learned when you were 7 years old. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. The 80s were the last decade of systematic emotional neglect disguised as normal childhood. Not abuse, not trauma in the clinical sense, something more subtle and more widespread. Your parents were there, but they were also the first generation to be completely consumed by careerism, by the idea that providing materially was the same as providing emotionally. You were the generation of latchkey kids, but the psychological impact wasn't about being alone after school. It was about learning that your emotional needs were an inconvenience to the adult world. That independence meant not needing anything from anyone. You internalized a very specific message, figure it out yourself, and you did. You became an expert at it. Picture this, you're 9 years old, you come home from school and the house is empty. You're supposed to do your homework, maybe heat up something in the microwave. There's a note on the counter. You skin your knee badly on your bike and instead of crying, you wash it yourself, find a band-aid and never mention it. Not because you're scared of your parents, but because somewhere deep down you've learned that handling things alone is what's expected, what's normal. This happened thousands of times in thousands of small ways, and each time you laid another brick in a wall you didn't know you were building. The psychology of the 80s child develops in stages, and most people who lived it don't realize they moved through these phases. Stage 1 was learning self-reliance as a survival skill. You figured out how to be alone without feeling lonely, how to entertain yourself for hours, how to solve your own problems. This felt like competence, and it was, but it was also the beginning of emotional isolation. Stage 2 was the performance of normalcy. You learned to read the room, to mirror what was expected. You became fluent in appearing well-adjusted. Your parents asked how school was and you said fine, even if you'd had the worst day of your young life, because you sensed correctly that they didn't actually have the bandwidth for the real answer. Stage 3 was the internalization. By your teenage years, you didn't even think about reaching out anymore. The wall was complete. You'd become the person who handles everything internally, the person people describe as low maintenance, and you wore that as a badge of honor, never realizing it was a coping mechanism you'd been forced to develop. Here's the truth most 80s kids don't want to face. Your independence isn't entirely a strength, it's also a defense. You learned to not need people because needing people felt dangerous, uncertain, like giving someone the power to let you down. And the cost of that, you struggle with intimacy in ways you can't quite name. You can have deep friendships and loving partnerships, but there's always a part of you that's unreachable, a part that stays in the observation deck, watching, protecting, never fully landing in the moment. You've built an entire identity around being the capable one, the one who doesn't fall apart. But underneath that, there's a child who never got to learn that it's safe to be vulnerable, that needing someone doesn't make you weak. Here's the shift. What if your self-sufficiency isn't who you are, but what you learned to do when you were small and had no other choice? You're not broken, you're adapted. You developed exactly the skills you needed to navigate an environment where emotional availability was scarce. And those skills served you. They got you here. But they're also costing you something, now. Because the world you're living in today isn't the world those defenses were built for. The people in your life now aren't your distracted parents. They're not going to shame you for having needs. But you're still operating like they will. You're still protecting yourself from a danger that no longer exists. The deepest pattern runs like this. You've spent your entire life proving you don't need anyone, and now you're exhausted by how well you've succeeded. You're surrounded by people, but you're still that kid coming home to an empty house, still washing your own wounds, still leaving no evidence that anything hurt. And here's what makes this so invisible. This isn't about your parents being bad people. It's about growing up in a decade that fundamentally misunderstood what children needed. The 80s told everyone that kids were resilient, that they'd be fine, that independence was a gift. And you were resilient. You are fine. But fine isn't the same as whole. Coming back to where we started, that feeling of watching life from behind glass. It's not a personality trait. It's a learned response. You're not emotionally distant by nature. You're distant because distance once kept you safe. The most profound thing you can understand about yourself is this: you don't have to be that self-sufficient anymore. The story you've been telling yourself, that you're the person who doesn't need help, who doesn't burden others, who can handle anything alone, that story was written by a child who had no other options. You're not that child anymore, and the people who love you aren't waiting for you to be perfect or independent or fine all the time. They're waiting for you to let them in. Not because you're falling apart, but because that's what connection actually is. You grew up in a decade that taught you to build walls and call them character, and now you get to decide if you want to keep them.